If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Amos chapter 7. Amos being one of the minor prophets toward the end of the Old Testament books of prophets. Amos chapter 7. What I find so fascinating, and I found this true when I traveled. When I was traveling with the two different Christian bands with whom I traveled, I noticed that when we got to places, the people that were, and I don't like the word in charge, let's just say the people that were facilitating whatever was going on, they always struck me as the last people that I might have chosen. And that is so true in God's economy, that He picks people that are not of renown, they're not of great skill necessarily. He picks people that are almost a polar opposite of what one would think would be the right person for that job from a human perspective, and He places them in those places of usefulness. And I remember once hearing an evangelist say, and I agree with it, God's plans just look crazy to us. Yet God is looking for something very specific. He's looking for someone who will simply obey. Let's take a look at Amos chapter 7. I'll begin reading in verse 7 of Amos 7. Then God showed me this. I saw the sovereign one standing by a wall, holding a plumb line in his hand. The Lord said to me, "What do you see, Amos?" "A wall," I said. Then God said, "Look, I am about to place a plumb line up against my people Israel. I will no longer overlook their sin. Isaac's center of worship will become desolate. Israel's holy places will be in ruins. I will attack Jeroboam's dynasty with the sword." Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent this message to King Jeroboam of Israel, saying, "Amos is conspiring against you in the very heart of the kingdom of Israel. The land cannot endure his prophecies." As a matter of fact, Amos is saying this: Jeroboam himself will die by the sword, and Israel will certainly be carried into exile away from its land. Amaziah then said to Amos, "Leave, you visionary. Run away to the land of Judah. Earn your living and prophesy there. Don't prophesy in Bethel any longer, for the royal temple and the palace are there." Amos replied to Amaziah, "I was not a prophet by profession. No, I was a herdsman who also took care of sycamore fig trees. Then the Lord took me from tending the flocks and the trees and gave me this commission: Go, prophesy to my people Israel." So now listen to the Lord's message. You say don't prophesy against Israel, don't preach against the family of Isaac. Therefore this is what the Lord says to you: Your wife will become a prostitute in the streets. Your sons and your daughters will die violently. Your sons and daughters will die, your land will be given over to others, and you will die in a foreign land yourself, and Israel will certainly be carried into exile away from its land. I can understand why Amos was not a popular person in Israel. And you have to remember, we're in the 780s to 740s BC roughly, when Assyria is the ascendant power in the world. And if this is prior to Hezekiah's ascendancy as the king of Judah, wherein the revival came to Judah, and Hezekiah, he stood up against the Assyrians in his revival. Amos is a prophet from Judah. He's from the southern kingdom in Tekoa in Judah, and he's prophesying to the northern kingdom. He was once a sheep herder, and he tended trees, sycamore figs. He wasn't the son of a prophet. He wasn't educated in the prophetic schools. And if you remember back in the story of Naaman the Assyrian and Elisha, you remember there was a school of prophets. There were prophets' schools where this thing was actually taught in some degree. But Amos has no standing in either place. He doesn't have standing in the southern kingdom as a prophet. There he's a herdsman and a farmer, and he has no standing in the northern kingdom because he's a foreigner, essentially. And he's in this northern kingdom now. This is about 175 years after the kingdom was divided into two, right after the reign of Solomon. And the northern kingdom has become very wealthy, very wealthy. This is really a geographical kind of thing. Jeroboam had conquered great expanses of the Levant, that is Israel, and expanded its territory. The Arameans under Ben-Hadad III had been conquered, and of Syria they'd been defeated. And there's actually an archaeological stele. Now a stele is S-T-E-L-E. It's a stone pillar of varying sizes, and there's writing around it. And in it, it records the fact that Ben-Hadad III had been defeated by Jeroboam. So we know this to be true. And the ascendancy of Assyria is about 40 years away. Tiglath-Pileser III and all of the Assyrian kings have not yet risen to the ascendancy. They're not the superpower on the stage just yet. So the Aramean dominance of Syria has been ended, and now Damascus is in the control of the northern kingdom. Well, this was an important trade route that passed through here from way up above in the Chaldean region where that became Babylon, all the way down to Egypt, and the trade passed through this area. So you can imagine, just like here where we live, I-75 is about 60 miles to the west of us here, where it passes through a town, and that town has now become a metropolitan center because the population has exploded. Why? You've got a major thoroughfare with all the trucks and everything else coming through there, and commerce has been generated, wealth has been generated by the fact of that trade route passing through this town 60 miles to the west of where we are right now. Well, in the ancient world, these trade routes were very important. There weren't many of them. There were no highways, no super highways like that. And so if you had a route that was passable, towns grew up around these routes, and pretty soon wealth started to be accumulated there. What has happened? Well, the landowners have become, if you read the whole book of Amos, you see this play out in the way that Amos describes the northern kingdom. As wealth accrues, what happens when a group of people, or a nation especially, or even an area get very, very wealthy? Well, usually corruption ensues. There's all kinds of corruption. Politicians learn that they can extract some of that wealth via corrupt practices. Business people learn that they can gouge other people. And then what happens is the people who are poor, who can't take advantage of these levers of power and wealth, they get left behind. And what you have is a bigger and bigger gap between the very, very poor and the wealthy. And the wealthy class continues to grow, and it leaves the poor class behind. And pretty soon you have what essentially would be deemed in the Middle Ages serfdom. That is, the wealthy, they can go buy up big tracts of land. I mean, let's say you're a subsistence farmer in the northern kingdom, in Galilee, and some wealthy person comes up and says, I'll pay you X for this land, and the number that gets quoted to you is 5 times what you would have expected the land to be worth. You do a little digging, and sure enough, it is 5 times what the land's worth, but the person who's got the money to buy it does not care. You sell your land. You do all right, but then what about others around you? And pretty soon, all of the land and the holdings becomes concentrated in a central group of people, and the middle class evaporates. You know, I remember when I lived in Pennsylvania, what used to trouble me was to watch these housing developments go in on farmland. There was a farm, you'd see a cultivated field for 2 or 3 years, and all of a sudden you'd see the cultivation cease, and then you'd see some roads go in, and then you'd see some transformers put in, and then you'd see a sign go up saying, new homes for sale. And pretty soon that 40 or 50 acre field that was growing whatever it was growing now is growing houses. And I used to worry about that. The reason I worried about it is different from this, but it's you see that kind of encroachment where the wealthy take over land mass, and they leave the people who owned it better off, but then those people die, and they leave to their children, and pretty soon the wealth becomes depleted, and the concentration of wealth grows greater and greater, and people get left behind, and the gap between rich and poor grows greater and greater, and the people become exploited. This is exactly, if you read Amos, this is exactly what this shows. As a matter of fact, archaeological digs in the northern kingdom attributed to this area, located in this area and at this time in history, in the 780s or so BC, you see there are little clay tablets with orders on them for oil, but not just any old oil, refined oil. and then filtered wine. Those two processes were reserved for the wealthy. The average person could no way afford to have their wine filtered or their oil refined in this way. So it shows that there was a large group of wealthy people here. Now, of course, economic changes produce what? Psychological, and I would say additionally, as a Christian, spiritual changes. The influence of the Canaanite culture was strong. And you have to remember, the Jews are just Semites. They're God's people. They're chosen. But they are Semites still, and their history is that of polytheism and idolatry. Why do you think the Old Testament is replete with God reminding them time and time and time and time again to avoid idolatry and punishing them when they fall into it? Well, Canaanite religion, Baal worship, the worship of Anat, where Anat worship entailed ritual prostitution. And in some of the old Ugaritic writings, she is portrayed as a butcher walking in a river of blood up to her knees. How did you worship Anat? You went to the temple and you indulged your carnal fantasies with prostitutes, men and women. Drunkenness and violence and sensuality, all these were features of the Canaanite worship system. And this gradually came in to Israel and the northern kingdom. And of course, none of this has anything to do with the very austere worship of the invisible God that had been prescribed in the Tanakh or in the Torah. And thus, God is going to set the plumb line of His law next to them and say, okay, how far have you leaned? How far have you leaned? Well, the text indicates that they had leaned really far, and they don't like Amos's prophecy here at all. As a matter of fact, they take his prophecy to be treason against the king. And even more striking, because Amos is not native to the northern kingdom. He's a southern kingdom native. So what's he doing there? I mean, this is the way the reaction would be. What are you doing here, Amos? You're not of us. You're coming here to criticize us. Who's this hayseed upstart from the southern kingdom, which was looked down upon by the northern, telling the king of Israel what to do? Who does Amos think he is? Right? And that's the perspective. He should go back to his figs and his goats and leave us alone. We're just fine here. He's got no prophetic credentials to his credit. Why did God pick Amos? So Amaziah and the king think, why should we listen to him? He's nobody. None of his prophecies sound good to me, says the king. Amaziah says the same. And it's Rex Lex. Let's face it, the king is law. If the king wants to dispense with you for these troublesome prophecies, he's within all rights to do so, and you can say nothing. Remember Jeremiah. He got thrown into a hole. Now this all seems so contemporary to me as I think about our culture. God's edicts today, you go into it wasn't long ago I saw somebody on the floor of Congress saying something to the effect of, you will pay the price before God. And I could hear the laughter. What are you talking about? Take that primitive, misogynistic, wicked, narrow thinking someplace else. And it was no different in Amos's time. The poor were exploited in Amos's time by the rich. They're poor exploited today. Serfdom is slowly being reinstituted. I don't know if you're aware of that or not. And if you look at what socialism offers, it offers a scenario wherein the ruling elites will be those who have the money and the power, and everybody else would just be in service to them. The wealthy elites then will do just what they were doing in Israel at this time. They were making sure that the laws that were written were favorable to their needs and their wants. And slowly but surely, the powerless become subjugated to the powerful. Now, God sees all this happening. And God is not going to put up with exploitation of people forever. That's something we in our culture should keep in mind. It should be right here all the time. God is not going to put up with the exploitation of the weak, the vulnerable. He is not. He's not just demanding in worship and in ritual. No. He's demanding in ethical and moral behavior. We need to remember that. The people of Israel were in a covenant relationship with God. If you don't think this is true, go back and read Deuteronomy chapter 28. Read it from top to bottom. And what do you find? A list of all the blessings that God will bring them if they will remain faithful to Him. And then a list of all the cursings that will come if they do not. Well, we're no different. We are the people of the covenant now. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit now. And most people in our world, in the West, think themselves far too powerful and sophisticated. We're above all of this religious nonsense that has to do with God issuing commands. Our elites see themselves as too important to even obey their own rules. And people who believe in God and respect God and want to serve God and want to honor God are seen as primitive, kind of throwbacks to a long gone era where none of this really matters anymore. It's so easy in our culture to dismiss the truth of God's Word. God is not going to tolerate licentiousness forever. We would do well to remember that. But He's going to bring correction, because we are now His covenant people who have been grafted in. That's Paul's argument in the Romans, the letter to the Romans. We have been grafted in. We were the wild olive branch. We've been grafted into the native olive branch by virtue of the cross. And it can be, as it was in the northern kingdom, that the only way that God can shake us out of our lethargy and shake us out of our willingness to accommodate evil and shake us out of our willingness to accommodate the weak being exploited is to bring disaster. I mean, even if it's an innocent blindness that we have, God's got to do something, right? I mean, what tools are available to Him? Warm, fuzzy feelings? Never works. God's moral character will be vindicated in this universe. He's going to win in His creation. We might as well just settle that in our minds. But from my perspective, as a follower of Jesus, it seems to me to be far better if I'm going to be caught up in God's correction. And I may be, we all may be. It seems far better to be caught up on the side of God's desires, as opposed to being caught up and just mystified at the happenings. The people of the northern kingdom, when the Assyrians came and did exactly what Amos prophesied they would do, killed people, put the king to the sword, put his family to the sword, deported vast numbers of the people of the northern kingdom to Assyria, and imported vast numbers of the Assyrians back into the northern kingdom. Why do you think that the northern kingdom was looked down upon by the southern in terms of ethnicity? They were the mongrels, you see. They had intermarried and become partially like the Assyrians. They had blended with them syncretistically in both their ethnicity, in marriage, and in their spiritual practice, in adopting the idolatry of the Assyrians. It's not a fear thing. It's a good thing to be aligned with God in these things. To be the nobodies, like Amos, who are obedient and do the work of God here on this earth. That's the better place to be. Way better than to be caught up in the world and to find ourselves on the other side of that. Thank you all so much for your attention.